Part 1. The Unexpected Guest. 1,000 words. The rain had been falling since morning. Light and steady, washing the streets of Seattle with a soft silver glow. Inside a small townhouse on the corner of Lakeview Street, Emily Carter moved quietly through the kitchen. She had spent hours preparing dinner, her husband's favorite roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, a bottle of red wine waiting by the table. The soft sound of jazz filled the room, and for a moment she felt hopeful. It had been weeks since she and Daniel truly sat down together. Work, meetings, and late nights had become their normal rhythm. But tonight she wanted to remind him of how things used to be, just the two of them. Simple, warm, close. She set the table for two, adjusted the candles, and smiled when she saw the clock hit 7. Daniel was never early, but he was usually on time. She imagined him walking through the door, tired but happy to see her, maybe even surprised by the effort she had made. She smoothed her dress, fixed her hair, and waited. The doorbell rang. Her heart lifted instantly. She hurried to the door, her hand brushing the lock open. But when she pulled it wide, her smile froze. Daniel stood there, but he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, holding a small gift bag, smiling politely. She had bright blue eyes and the kind of easy confidence that made people notice her. "Emily," Daniel said quickly, his tone a little too light. "This is Chloe, a friend from work. She didn't have plans tonight, and I thought maybe she could join us." For a moment, the world tilted slightly. Emily's first instinct was to protest. This was supposed to be their evening. But the words didn't come. She felt something heavy and cold move through her chest, but her smile stayed in place. "Of course," she said softly, stepping aside. "Come in." Sighed, the house felt suddenly smaller. Chloe's laughter filled the air as Daniel poured wine. They sat together at the table, and though Emily tried to keep her tone friendly, she couldn't ignore the strange undercurrent in the room. Chloe was charming, funny, relaxed, comfortable in a way that only someone deeply familiar could be. She told stories about the office, how Daniel always took the longest to choose coffee, how he hummed while working. Daniel laughed freely, and each time he looked at Chloe, something flickered in his eyes, something Emily hadn't seen directed at her. In a long time, the food grew cold faster than usual. Emily ate little, pretending to listen, nodding at jokes she barely heard. From across the table, she watched her husband, the way his shoulders relaxed, the way he smiled without restraint. He looked happy, and that realization hurt more than anything else. After dinner, Daniel offered to show Chloe the new home office upstairs. "It'll only take a minute," he said, already halfway up the stairs. Emily sat alone, her hands wrapped around an untouched glass of wine. The candles flickered, throwing shadows across the walls. In that silence, she heard laughter from upstairs, soft, harmless maybe, but heavy in her chest. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing. Friends laugh. People visit. This wasn't strange. But something inside her whispered that everything had changed. When they came back down, Daniel looked almost startled to see her still sitting there. "We were just checking the new layout," he said quickly. Emily nodded. Chloe thanked her for the meal, saying it was lovely, and leaned in to hug her before leaving. Her perfume lingered, floral and sweet. Daniel walked her to the door. Emily stayed seated. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the glass like faint knocks. She heard their voices in the hallway, soft, low, too familiar. When the door finally closed, Daniel returned, loosening his tie, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. "It was nice, right?" he said casually. "I didn't think you'd mind." She forced a small smile. "No," she said quietly. "It's fine." They went to bed in silence. Daniel fell asleep almost immediately, breathing evenly beside her. Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind a storm of thoughts. The sound of rain grew louder, and somewhere deep inside her, something fragile began to crack. The next morning, she woke early. Daniel had already left for work, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cologne and a coffee cup on the counter. She cleaned the dishes from last night, wiped the table, and tried to convince herself it was just dinner, nothing more. But her heart wouldn't believe it. She thought about the way Daniel had looked at Chloe, the small smile that slipped from him whenever she spoke. It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. Over the next few days, Chloe's name began to appear more often. Chloe said this. Chloe laughed about that. Chloe's working late too. Every mention felt like a quiet reminder that Emily was no longer the center of his world. She tried to ignore it, but even the smallest details hurt. The way he checked his phone more often. The way he smiled at messages he never explained. One afternoon, while doing laundry, Emily found a strand of blonde hair on Daniel's jacket. It was small, thin, almost invisible, but unmistakable. She stared at it for a long time, holding it between her fingers, wondering how something so small could make her feel so lost. She didn't confront him. She didn't ask. She simply folded the jacket, placed it back in the closet, and continued with her day. In the evenings, she cooked dinner as always, waited for him, listened to his stories, and smiled when required. But behind her calm expression, her heart was slowly learning a painful truth that sometimes betrayal doesn't shout. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dressed like friendship, wearing familiar smiles. Weeks later, when Daniel mentioned that Chloe had joined his project full-time, Emily only nodded. She had run out of questions to ask. The distance between them had grown, not through arguments, but through silence. And though she still loved him, that love now lived with uncertainty. That night, as the city lights shimmered outside their window, Emily lay awake again, listening to the rain. The same rain that had fallen the night Chloe first walked in. It was strange how life could change in just one moment. One unexpected knock at the door. She turned on her side and watched Daniel sleep. His face looked peaceful, unbothered. She reached out, almost touched his hand, but stopped midway. She pulled the blanket closer instead. Her heart whispered that something precious had already slipped away. And she wasn't sure she would ever get it back. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, Emily finally understood what silence felt like when it wasn't peace. But the sound of something ending, and though she didn't say it aloud, a quiet thought formed inside her mind. He invited someone in, and I let it all happen. Clean, emotional, and policy-safe, mature themes of heartbreak and realization without any explicit or harmful content. Part 2. The distance between us, 1,000 words. The days after that night turned into quiet echoes of what life used to be. Emily still woke early, still made breakfast, still waited for Daniel to say good morning, but the warmth between them had thinned like fading light at sunset. He was there, yet far away. His phone buzzed more often. His laughter came less. And the name Chloe slipped into their conversations like an uninvited guest that refused to leave data first. Emily tried to convince herself it was just work. Daniel had always been ambitious, and Chloe was simply his colleague. But when evenings stretched longer and his excuses grew softer, something inside her began to crumble. He would come home late, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers, tired yet oddly content. When she asked about his day, he would smile distractedly and say, "It was fine." She noticed the distance in small ways, the way he no longer looked her in the eyes, the way he answered with half-hearted words, the way silence replaced laughter. Their home, once full of small conversations, now felt like an empty stage after a play had ended. One rainy Tuesday, Emily was folding Daniel's laundry when a small note slipped from his shirt pocket. She picked it up, confused at first, then froze. In neat handwriting, the words read, "Last night was perfect. Thank you." There was no name, no signature, but she didn't need one. Her hands trembled. The room felt suddenly smaller, her breath shorter. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the note as if it could explain itself. She could have confronted him, then held up the paper, demanded the truth. But she didn't. Her heart was tired, not angry. So she folded the note carefully and placed it in her drawer, hidden but heavy in her chest. She continued folding clothes one by one, as if doing something ordinary could keep her world from falling apart. That night, Daniel came home. She greeted him with a soft smile. He kissed her cheek absent-mindedly, unaware of the storm inside her. Over dinner, she asked how work was. "Busy," he said, glancing at his phone. "Chloe and I had to stay late again." The name hit her like a quiet blow, but she said nothing. She simply nodded and asked if he wanted more wine. As the weeks went on, Emily became a quiet observer of her own life. She noticed how Daniel's mood brightened whenever he got a message, how his eyes softened when he spoke of team lunches and late meetings. She noticed how he started wearing his favorite cologne again, the one he hadn't used in months. And she noticed how little space she occupied in his world. Now, how easily her presence had become background noise. One evening, while cleaning the kitchen, she looked at their wedding photo on the counter. They were laughing in that picture, carefree and young. She touched the glass gently, as if she could step back into that moment before the quiet lies. Before the ache of pretending everything was fine. But life doesn't rewind. It only moves forward. Even when you're not ready. She began to spend more time alone, long walks by the waterfront, coffee at the same corner cafe, quiet hours spent reading by the window. Sometimes she'd look at couples passing by, holding hands, and wonder if they too carried invisible cracks beneath their smiles. One Friday night, Daniel came home later than usual. His tie was loose, his hair slightly messy. Emily was sitting on the couch, pretending to watch a movie. He looked surprised to see her awake. "You should get some rest," he said softly, dropping his keys on the counter. "Were you with Chloe?" she asked, her voice calm. He hesitated just long enough for the truth to show in his eyes. "We were finishing a project," he said quickly. Emily nodded. She didn't argue. She simply said, "Okay," and turned back to the flickering screen. Inside, something quiet broke a final thread that had been holding her heart together. The next morning, she stood by the window watching Daniel leave for work. His car disappeared down the street, and she felt the weight of her silence pressing against her chest. She could no longer tell if her stillness was strength or surrender. That afternoon, her sister Rachel called. "You sound tired," Rachel said gently. Emily smiled faintly. "Just busy," she replied. She didn't mention the perfume, the note, the growing distance. It was easier to pretend than to explain. People always asked why women stayed. But they never understood that sometimes love doesn't disappear, it just changes shape, becoming something you endure instead of something you celebrate later that week. Daniel surprised her by bringing flowers home. "Just thought you'd like these," he said, placing them on the table. They were Lily, her favorite. For a moment, she almost believed he remembered. But when his phone buzzed and his eyes flickered toward it with that familiar look, she realized he was trying to cover guilt, not express love. She thanked him anyway and arranged the flowers in a vase. That night, while he slept, Emily lay awake staring at the ceiling. The city hummed quietly outside. She thought about leaving, packing her things, walking out, never looking back. But she didn't move. Not yet. Something about endings frightened her more than the pain of staying. A week later, she saw Chloe's name flash across Daniel's phone while he was in the shower. She didn't read the message. She didn't need to. The truth was already written across every moment they'd shared in the past months. She sat down at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and let herself cry quietly, steadily, without anger. The tears weren't for him anymore. They were for the love she had given, for the woman she used to be, for the years she could never reclaim. When Daniel came out of the shower, she was calm again. He asked if everything was all right, and she smiled. "Of course," she said softly. "Everything's fine." That night, as he drifted to sleep, she stood by the window, looking out at the city lights reflecting on the rain-soaked streets. Her heart still loved him, but she knew love alone couldn't fix what had already broken. The hardest part wasn't losing him. It was realizing she had lost herself in the process. Emily made herself a quiet promise. She would stop waiting for him to change. She would stop pretending not to notice the truth. She didn't know what tomorrow would look like, but she knew she needed to find herself again somewhere beyond this silence. And yet, even with that promise, when Daniel kissed her forehead before leaving for work the next morning, she let him. She let him pretend, let herself pretend. Because sometimes holding on feels safer than letting go. But deep down, She knew each day, each unanswered question, each quiet moment of pain was leading her towards something inevitable. The end wasn't loud. It was coming softly, like a tide that pulls you away without you realizing until your feet are no longer touching the ground. And in her heart, she whispered what she couldn't say out loud. I see it. I feel it. And still, I let it all happen, clean, emotional, and YouTube safe, focused on heartbreak, silence, and realization. No explicit or harmful content. Part 3. The quiet goodbye, 1,000 words. The morning light slipped softly through the curtains, brushing against Emily's face. She opened her eyes slowly, feeling the same hollow quiet that had filled the house for months. The air between her and Daniel had become something fragile, cold, polite, and distant. They still shared the same space, but not the same life. Conversations were brief, smiles were practiced, and love had turned into a quiet habit neither of them knew how to break. Daniel's alarm went off, and he moved through the room in silence, getting ready for work. Emily watched him button his shirt, the same shirt he used to wear on their early dates when he'd rush to meet her after long days. Back then, he'd smile every time he saw her. Now, his eyes barely met hers. He muttered a soft "see you tonight," kissed her forehead out of routine, and left. When the door closed, Emily sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. She didn't cry anymore. The tears had run out weeks ago. Now all that was left was a dull ache, like an old wound that refused to heal. She tried to fill her days long. Walks by the park, visits to her sister Rachel. Endless cups of coffee in quiet cafes, but no matter where she went, her thoughts followed her home. The memories, the laughter. The way Daniel used to look at her, it all stayed like shadows she couldn't escape. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, she heard the front door open earlier than usual. Daniel's voice called out softly, "Emily." She turned, surprised. He stood there, hands in his pockets, his face pale and unsure. Something about his expression made her heart tighten. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. She nodded, setting down the knife she was holding. For a long moment he just stood there, searching for words. Then, finally, he said, "I made a mistake." The room went still. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the only sound between them. Emily didn't ask which mistake. She didn't need to. The truth had been sitting with her for months, unspoken but heavy. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he continued, his voice trembling. "It just did, and I didn't know how to stop." Emily looked at him, not angry, not shocked, just tired. She felt the weight of every night she had waited for him, every time she had swallowed her questions, every silent dinner they'd shared. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known for a long time." Daniel's eyes filled with guilt. "Sorry," he whispered. She nodded, but there was no relief in hearing it. Apologies don't fix what's already broken. They just mark the moment when there's nothing left to say. He sat down, running his hands through his hair. I don't even know who I am anymore," he said softly. "I thought I could control it. I thought I could keep everything the same." Emily looked around the room, the walls they'd painted together, the photographs that still smiled from their frames. "Everything can't stay the same when love changes," she said, her voice steady but sad. They sat in silence. Two people who had once promised forever, now realizing forever, had an expiration date. After a while, Daniel stood up. "Do you hate me?" he asked. She shook her head. "No," she said. "I don't hate you. Just can't keep pretending." That night, she lay awake beside him for the last time. The rain started again outside, gentle and steady, like it had on the night Chloe first came to their door. It felt almost poetic, as if the sky was reminding her how it all began. She watched Daniel sleep, his face peaceful, unaware that by morning everything would change, at dawn. Emily quietly packed a small bag, just clothes, a few books, and the photo of her parents that always brought her comfort. She looked around the house once more. Every corner held memories. The kitchen where they danced, the couch where they dreamed, the bed where they'd stopped talking. She left a note on the counter, short and simple. Take care of yourself. I'll be staying with Rachel for a while. When Daniel woke up, she was gone. Driving toward Portland, the sky opened into pale blue. For the first time in months, she felt air filling her lungs completely. She didn't know if she was ready for freedom, but she knew she couldn't stay trapped in a love that had already faded. The road ahead felt uncertain, but it also felt like a beginning. At her sister's home, Rachel hugged her tightly. You did the right thing, she said softly. You deserve peace. Emily smiled faintly, though her heart still carried the ache. She spent the next few days in quiet recovery, sleeping, walking through the garden, listening to the sound of the wind in the trees. Each day, the heaviness lifted a little more. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. I miss you. I don't know how to fix this. Emily read it slowly, her fingers hovering over the screen. For a moment, she considered replying. But then she looked out at the sunlight spilling over the yard and realized she didn't need to. Some stories didn't need to be fixed, they needed to end. So something new could begin. She placed the phone face down on the table and took a deep breath. The air smelled of rain and earth, clean and new. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't waiting. She was just free. That night, Emily lay in bed and thought about everything she had, endured the silence, the pretending, the heartbreak. She realized that the hardest part hadn't been losing Daniel. It had been losing herself while trying to hold on to him. But now she was finding her way back. In the weeks that followed, Daniel called a few times. Sometimes she answered, sometimes she didn't. Their conversations were calm, polite, almost friendly, but the warmth was gone. One evening, he said quietly, You sound happier. I am, she replied. And I hope you will be too. There was a long pause. Then he said, You always deserved better than what I gave you. Emily smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Maybe, she said softly, but maybe I needed all this to finally understand who I am. After the call ended, she stood by the window, watching the stars. For the first time, the silence felt peaceful, not empty. Weeks turned into months. She found work at a small bookstore downtown, made new friends, and began writing again, something she hadn't done in years. Each day felt a little lighter, a little more hers. Sometimes she thought of Daniel, but the memory no longer hurt. It was simply part of her story, a chapter she had lived through and learned from. One evening, as she closed the shop, the sunset painted the sky gold and pink. She stood there for a while, breathing in the calm. She thought about everything that had happened, the love, the betrayal, the silence. And the leaving on realized she didn't regret any of it, 'cause it had taught her something powerful. That endings are not failures. They're beginnings disguised as loss. And as the city lights flickered to life around her, she whispered to herself, I let it happen, but I also let it go. She smiled a real, quiet smile and walked home under the soft glow of the evening. For the first time in a long time, Emily wasn't just surviving. She was living clean, emotional, and 100% YouTube safe. Focused on self-discovery, forgiveness, and quiet strength. No explicit or harmful content suitable for mature romantic storytelling audiences in the US and Canada.